Hello everyone. In today's video we're going to be looking at some of Bertolt Brecht's theories. Bertolt Brecht was a theatre practitioner and he had a lot of interesting theories, mainly relevant to acting, but I think it can be applied to a lot of different things. I looked at Bertolt Brecht when I wrote my PhD and that focused on music, so... Today we're going to be discussing the Alienation Effect, epic theatre, Gestus, contradiction and complex seeing. We'll also be exploring what realism means, and we'll be questioning what it means to be innovative today, or how we can be innovative today. The Alienation Effect. Brecht's Alienation Effect is about encouraging the audience to look at the familiar in a new way. That is, to make the familiar unfamiliar, or strange. When performing the alienation effect, the actor has to not only inhabit their character, but simultaneously remember that they are simply an actor portraying that character. This duality or double vision has to come across during the actor's performance, and in some ways this makes it quite complicated. Portraying to the audience that the actor is merely an actor stops the audience from getting lost in the performance and finding that cathartic release, as they typically would from more traditional theatre and self-indulgent acting. Instead, they are constantly reminded that this is a performance, and so they are alienated from the events on stage. They are constantly reminded that they are watching an actor. So, how would an actor go about acting in a Brechtian way? Well, as Unwin writes in The Complete Brecht Toolkit, Brecht sometimes asks his actors in rehearsal to perform in the third person, prefacing each speech with he said, she said. At other times he made them highlight particularly important moments by adding, instead of responding like this, he responded like that. At other times he asked them to read the stage directions aloud. He wanted his actors to do two things at once: play the scene and provoke a discussion with the audience about its content. Brecht required his actors to break that fourth wall and be constantly aware of their audience. He even wanted them to address the audience directly. This is an approach that is also prevalent in Shakespearean acting. Anyway, by eliminating the fourth wall, this prevented the audience from getting sucked into the drama and stopped them from empathising with the characters as much as they would with other types of acting. Epic theatre. Another term you'll hear associated with Brecht is epic theatre. In this book here, Unwin describes epic theatre as dialectics in practice. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Epic theatre is where the narrative is told through a juxtaposition of contrasting scenes. Not only can the content of each scene be incongruous, but also the style and or approach of each scene can be incongruous. Unwin writes that interruptions are encouraged, text is set against action, music introduced, scenery is cut away, unconnected scenes follow on from each other, and a new kind of unity emerges. By exposing the audience to such a broad range of conflicting elements, Brecht hoped they would think independently and come to their own conclusions. And so, the epic theatre is nothing less than dialectics in practice. In a nutshell, epic theatre is a disconnected collection of incidents that should be embraced by the actor. The contradictions should be relished, and the actor must play each scene one after the other and not try to introduce any consistency. As Unwin writes, they should embrace the jagged, disconnected elements of the story. It's not only contradiction that is central in Brecht's epic theatre, but also change. Brecht explains that this juxtaposition of incongruous scenes or segments in the play not altogether add up to a single unchangeable character, but to one which changes all the time and becomes more and more clearly defined in the course of this way of changing. And this is from The Question of Criteria for Judging Acting, 1931, also quoted in Unwin, page 61. In Brecht's epic theatre, the actors themselves change the props, the scenery, and their own costumes, all in full view of the audience. When I went to see Brecht's Mother Courage and her children, the changing rooms were placed in the lobby area, in full view of us all. We could see all the costumes that were going to be put on, and I assume that's where the actors got changed. Before the play started, the actors could see all the costumes. We were reminded before we went in that we were going to watch a play. So, by letting the audience see behind the curtain, as it were, they're constantly being made aware that what they are watching is a play. This alienates them from the events in the play. It prevents them from getting sucked in. As Unwin describes it in this great book, it is a good book, to be fair, it forces the audience to see the play as a gesture towards illusion, a presentation of a world that is capable of being changed. You might be wondering why Brecht did this in theatre. Well, as Unwin writes, Brecht wanted to encourage his audience to think critically about what was being presented and to see natural events as unnatural and resistible. I suppose the whole point is that he wanted to say to people, the world is as it is, yes, but it doesn't have to be like this. Even though for some reason you think it does. I think that's the main takeaway point here. Gestus. As a basic starting point, the word gestus can be compared to the English word gesture. Yeah. Unwin writes, Gestic theatre is nothing less than a dramatic and physical demonstration of the way that the world works. Put simply, gestus involves a focus on physical actions that convey meaning. Gestus basically means presenting an action with quotation marks around it. It's things like the pointed finger, the shrugged shoulder, the turned back, and so on. We all know what these mean. These gestures. So gestus is basically gestures or actions that are easily recognisable and understood by an audience. Which makes you wonder. So I guess he's basing it a lot on preconceived ideas about things. Yes, he's taking our preconceived ideas about things. He uses what we know as a starting point, basically. And the gesture is the most rawest form, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, Unwin writes that Brecht would sometimes ask his actors to preface each action with a little comment. This is how the landlord pays his peasants' wages. The point was to encourage a kind of acting that was playful and objective and demonstrated individual observations with a set of clearly defined physical attitudes, which could easily be understood. Instead of acting and getting sucked in and being all, Stanislavski-esque or the method or whatever, you would just be like, this is how a person walks into a room having just received some bad news. And then you'd act it in a way that's sort of slightly distanced. It's more like you're demonstrating the narrative rather than living it. It's more like, let's analyse the situation and let's just see how absurd it is, because actually when you take a step back from any event in life, you can see it for what it is, can't you? You can assess it better. And I guess you can see the absurdity of things when you take a step back. People become less appealing at a distance. So, Brecht liked to contrast different gestures, or gests, G-E-S-T-S. He liked to contrast them in a striking way to get his audiences to critique what they were watching. And I suppose these stark contrasts help with the alienation effect. Brecht was keen to emphasise that the performance should be made up of a series of gests, many of which might seem strikingly contradictory. So the takeaway point here is basically an emphasis on contradictions and recognisable actions. Contradictions, recognisable actions. This is Brecht playing with the familiarity of recognisable actions. He's adding unfamiliarity into the mix by way of contradiction, and this is what should cause the audience to question what they're watching and their preconceived ideas about what was familiar to them. It should cause the audience to think about how what they know might be socially conditioned, and therefore maybe they could just as easily know something different. Brecht is basically saying the world doesn't have to be like this, but he's saying it in a way that allows the audience members to come to these conclusions themselves. It's no good if you just tell them to think that, because they won't. They have to realise this themselves. I think that's what he's trying to do. I'll explain this in a bit more detail when we talk about complex seeing. Unwin writes, Gestus presents human relationships as shaped by their underlying social circumstances and, especially when presented as epic theatre and including the alienation effect, holds them up to scrutiny in such a way that they seem changeable. Yes, the important point here is that they seem changeable. We are the ones that make the world what it is, and it doesn't have to be like this. It's changeable. And we know Brecht focused in his narratives on politics and war and misery and all this stuff that goes on in the world, and it doesn't have to be like this. Contradiction now. A defining characteristic of Brecht's work is contradiction, and it's one of the reasons why I really like Brecht. I do love contradictions. Just because they're everywhere, and it's just better to work with them than to just try and battle them. Brecht knew that society is made up of contradictions, and he knew that the contradictions inherent in society appear in the makeup of the individual as well. Essentially, therefore, an individual person is just a product of society, and vice versa. We make up society. It's a tangled mess. It's dialectical, but I'm going to talk about dialectics in another video because, we're on about Brecht for now, But the main point here is that contradictions run through society and therefore individuals. Now, in this instance, contradictions are seen in a negative light. However, this would change. Unwin says this. In his late work, Brecht's late work, this interest in contradictions became more positive. His reading of Voltaire and the other philosophies of the Enlightenment, as well as classical Chinese philosophy, turned it into an exercise in dialectical thinking. On the one hand this, on the other hand, that was, he felt, the approach that stood most chance of approximating to the truth of the world. Unwin is majorly simplifying dialectics here. I dare say he's talking more about a classical view of dialectics, but this isn't to say that Brecht viewed dialectics in this way. I like to think that Brecht knew all about dialectics, especially because he was like friends kind of with Walter Benjamin, and Walter Benjamin knew Adorno, and Adorno really knew how to explain dialectics. This isn't to say that Unwin doesn't know about dialectics, but he's not really tapped into the essence of the dialectic in this part of the text. Wait there a minute, I'm back. I'll discuss dialectics in more detail in another series of videos, but for now, to get a better understanding of dialectics, read this book here, Adorno's Introduction to Dialectics. It's really great. Yeah. Unwin does write more about the importance of contradictions, and he alludes to a sort of dialectical way of thinking, but not in a way that actually explains the role of dialectical thinking in Brecht's work. He writes that the greatest plays offer us a Hegelian syllogism, a conflict of opposites. One group wants one thing, another wants the opposite, and the disagreement between the two resolves itself into a third position. This sounds like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which isn't at all dialectical because it's a simplification, it's a structure, and dialectics are about intrinsic contradictions on absolutely every level. Therefore, you can't systematise dialectical thinking at all. In Unwin's defence, though, he doesn't actually mention the word dialectic in this sentence. He calls it a syllogism, doesn't he? But I'm not actually sure this is what Hegel proposed. This is an oversimplification of Hegel, for sure. Oof. Dialectics are fun. I have a series on dialectics coming out, so stay tuned for that. Complex seeing. Complex seeing is basically where the contradictions that Brecht presents us cause us to critically think about the play's events. It's what essentially prevents us from getting totally sucked into the narrative. Complex seeing is something much more dynamic than stoical despair at the contradictions of the world. Instead, Brecht asked his actors to make these contradictions visible and show the link between wealth and poverty, money and power, injustice and greed. By exposing the different sides of the argument, he hoped to encourage understanding and provoke debate. Brecht's characters themselves are built on contradictory principles. For instance, mothers sacrifice their children to make a living so that they can provide for their children, so that they can in turn sacrifice them, presumably. I'm thinking of Mother Courage and her children now. In other plays, good women become bad men in order to survive their worlds. Shen Te becomes a bad man, Shui Ta, in order to survive. Mother Courage sacrifices her children so as to make a living. Galileo abandons pure scientific pursuit because of its personal implications, and Puntilla, who is generous when drunk, reverts to brutality when sober. The point is that these contradictions are not the result of bad writing, they are deliberate and realistic portraits of the way that people behave in a contradictory world. Contradictions, Brecht believe, express underlying realities. And it's true, people are a bunch of contradictions. The point is that these observations about these characters are deliberately counterintuitive, and they make us rethink our notions of common sense or nature. These contradictions are deliberate and realistic portraits of the way that people behave in a contradictory world. Contradictions, Brecht believe, express underlying realities. But what is it to express reality in a play? Now on to realism. Brecht frequently argued that his theoretical innovations were simply a way of bringing a greater degree of realism to his portrayals of modern experience, just as the Cubists claimed that their paintings, by combining a variety of perspectives, were a truer portrayal of their subjects than Impressionism. So Brecht insisted that his theoretical style was a better way of depicting the reality of 20th century naturalism. The word Brecht insisted on was realism. This notion of trying to present different perspectives simultaneously really interests me. I find it fascinating because life is a melange of contradictions and contrasting perspectives. This is just natural and we live this. But when you're presented with these contradictions, like in one fell swoop on a stage, there's a sort of jarring. It's somehow unfamiliar and you're alienated from what you're seeing and you're forced to critically think about things. And this is despite life being like this. Anyway, what is realism exactly? Because it's quite complicated. People like to think of it as a style, and it's not. Unwin writes that realism is best regarded as an attitude to the world, not an artistic style in its own right. Yes, it's not a style. It doesn't render an artwork with specific traits. As Brecht writes, we shall take care not to ascribe realism to a particular period, so to set up merely formal and literary criteria of realism. Our conception of realism needs to be broad and political, free from independent restrictions and independent of convention. Yeah, don't go reifying realism. That's all it needs. The way I see it is, it's an organic attitude that changes with each artistic medium and that medium's subsequent styles. It's basically an intention to portray reality as truthfully as possible. That's not to say that the artworks themselves won't bring up different styles, and they probably will. Compare Impressionism with Cubism, for example. Just different attitudes to being realist, and they have different stylistic traits. Here's a quote from Brecht's The Popular and the Realistic, 1937. In the theatre, reality can be represented in a factual or fantastic form. The actors can do without makeup, appearing natural, and the whole thing can be fake. They can wear grotesque masks and represent the truth. And this is precisely why I have trouble with the term realistic acting. And phrases like, how to act realistically. Acting is generally fake anyway. I do know what people mean when they say acting realistically, obviously. But I think this particular type of realistic acting isn't a realistic portrayal of life. It is just this conflicted, troubled soul, lots of thought behind the eyes that contradict your movements, and it looks realistic. But it's not going to look realistic in the future because we're constantly changing and evolving, and all you can do is present the reality of a situation in this moment now. I'm explaining this kind of arse about face. Think about it. When you want to act realistically, is it just a particular style you're after, or are you genuinely trying to portray a truth? Because Brecht arguably portrayed a truth with his Alienation and Gestus and so on. These mannerisms in Brechtian acting aren't really obviously natural, although they are naturally existent in society. They exist. This is what life is like. What aspect of reality are you trying to portray? And this presents another contradiction here, doesn't it? Because even though the mannerisms don't seem natural, they are naturally occurring. We come from the mindset that everything is segmented into different definitions and boundaried off: realistic acting, non-realistic acting, Brechtian acting and all that. The notion of contradictions exist. Things aren't so opposite. Things tend to merge into one another. Stay tuned for these videos on dialectics, which will be coming out soon. Here's another quote from Brecht, The Popular and the Realistic. The words popularity and realism therefore are natural companions. It is in the interest of the people, the broad working masses, that literature should give them truthful representations of life, and truthful representations of life are in fact only of use to the broad working masses, the people, so that they have to be suggestive and intelligible to them, i.e. popular. Okay, so this is interesting. Brecht is saying that this realist attitude will only be effective on the working masses, essentially. I'm now wondering if realism is like being avant-garde. I mean, genuinely avant-garde. To genuinely be forward-thinking. And like breaks free from prior stylistic boundaries and established convention. If this is the case, though, if realism is like being genuinely avant-garde, then does essentially pandering to the masses simultaneously free art from high society, but also restrict it in the sense that the artwork in question has to reduce itself to pop in order to be intelligible? Would the artwork have to become commodified in doing so? Or is it at least in danger of becoming commodified in doing so? Is it even possible to be free from high esoteric circles of upper classes and at the same time not have to reduce it to reproducible popularity? Is Brecht's work the solution to this conundrum? How popular were Brecht's plays? I mean, they're not part of mass pop culture today, but the narratives are still relevant. So have they managed to be relatable to the masses yet somehow eschewed the constraints of commodity fetishism? I don't think so, because I think they're seen as being high art now. They're not like popular with mass culture, are they? I don't think the function of his plays are self-evident. Basically, Brecht was there to try and convince his audience that the world is a mess and it doesn't have to be like this. And yeah, he tried to do it in this way that sort of was intelligible to the masses. Has he succeeded in doing that? Or does anybody watch Brecht? Like, are they popular? Is he popular? Do you have to read this book in order to understand what he's trying to do? I don't know. If only people who understand Brecht can understand his plays, then he's wasted his effort, hasn't he? This takes me on to innovation versus formalism. So this is where things really get interesting. Just to get you up to speed, we've looked at Brecht's Alienation, Gestus, epic theatre. Basically, all this thought-out methodical approach to forcing an audience to critically think about their situation can be seen as systematised and formalistic. Think about it. Giving a name, Alienation, epic theatre, working with contradictions. This is a thought-out method, essentially, isn't it? Which is fine. Obviously, we're human, this is how things have to work. I mean, even though essentially Brecht attempts to break all these preconceived socially conditioned boundaries by highlighting the inherent conditions in society and people, he's using a boundary systematized theoretical approach, isn't he? So here's some gossip. Right, Brecht was accused of dwelling with artistic formalism and being more interested in artistic innovation than in reaching out to the popular audiences. Notice how these two things are seen as things that can't work together. Like, you can't be artistically innovative and you can't work to popular audiences at the same time. Now, it was George Lukács who accused Brecht of turning his back on the working class. But Brecht argued that working people had the least to lose in abandoning the old ways and were uniquely suited to enjoy radical and progressive art, and that those who insisted on traditional forms were the real formalists. Yeah. So here Brecht is basically arguing that artistic innovation and popular audiences can go hand in hand, and more so than the otherwise assumed partnership between artistic innovation and high society. The high society lot, the educated masses, whatever, those privileged people, they're not going to change for anyone, are they? Let's be real. They want to keep exploiting the lower classes so that they can continue to live the high life and pretend that they love art. And another reason why the working people will be more open-minded to progressive art than the more privileged or educated, at least, is that they're less likely to be educated in the ways of how art has been, historically speaking. I mean, they won't be bogged down by all those preconceived ideas about how art should be. I'll explain this better with an example. Right, I'm self-taught, essentially. I thought to get into university and to study music, it wasn't something that was inherently thrust upon me. I wanted it. So I guess I've got this mindset that's not really formalistic. I kind of naturally want to just think, well, why can't you write music like this? Why does it have to be like that? And people are like, oh, that's not correct. If you think about history of music, Debussy already did that. It's like, well, I'm not actually copying Debussy, am I? I'm just like maybe using the harp a bit with harmonics and maybe I want to look at what Xenakis did as well, and that was kind of cool. But I'm not copying him. I'm just like inspired, and does it matter? And they're like, oh, no, you must progress. And you end up writing something that's very formalised and not creative at all. And I'm not saying you should think about the past when you write music. I'm just saying you should not think about anything. Write what you want. Let me just get to the point. In my own compositional practice, I like to challenge notions of the avant-garde style. I deliberately go against all the agreed upon stylistic traits such as atonality, extended instrumental techniques, noise for the sake of noise, and so on. But I still integrate atonality and extended instrumental techniques, but not in a way that satisfies a typical audience of avant-garde music. And this is avant-garde with a capital A-G, by the way. This blatant carefree disregard for the avant-garde ways jars very much with the audiences educated in the avant-garde style. In order to be radical and new and free, we mustn't get bogged down by rules and methods and specific ways. We are people of this world, and we have to move forward practically from the heart, not theoretically from the head. I mean, it's probably a bit of both. But we focus too much on theory nowadays. Everything becomes a definition and a style. You can't do anything theoretically. Anything done in theory is just that. It's done in theory.